All right, yeah! Thank God for fantasy football. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is called Redemption Rehab. Today, we're talking about the Week 8 must-have players in the weekly waiver wire report, starting with this guy, Jauan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. He's going to be the hot pickup this week. He's owned in 52% of the fantasy football leagues out there. He did not play last week. Why? Because he's got a hip injury. Is he going to play this week? It's hard to say. They go on bye next week. But with the injuries to Brandon Ayuk, this is the guy they think is going to fill that spot in the next week or two. So people are going out and picking him up for that stretch run of the fantasy football playoffs. Who else do we like on San Francisco? How about this guy we talked about in our NFL draft preview show? Rookie Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. He's owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 3 catches for 21 yards on 5 targets. But the problem with Ricky Pearsall is before the season started, he got shot in a mugging accident in San Francisco. He's healthy now. It's crazy what happens in this world, especially in San Francisco. But we really like Ricky Pearsall, so you should consider picking him up. Other guys you want to know about on San Francisco that might fill the Brandon Ayuk void, how about Chris Connolly and Ronnie Bell? Other guys we like, we got to deal with this injury situation down there in Tampa Bay. Chris Godwin's out for the year with a dislocation of his ankle. Hey, good luck, Chris. You're a great player. We love you. And Mike Evans is out probably till sometime in November. So they got to replace both wide receivers. These are the guys you should be thinking about. Starting with the guy that's probably going to be a hot pickup this week is Jalen McMillan. Another guy you need to know about is Trey Palmer. And a third guy is a veteran, Sterling Shepard. He used to play for the New York Giants. Look, one of these guys is going to be the guy that's going to step up. Maybe 2 of these guys. But the guy you really want is a tight end we've been talking about all year. That's why you got to hit that subscribe button. We've been talking about Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week with those injuries, he had 8 catches for 100 yards on 10 targets. So that's probably the guy with the 3 running backs we've been talking about for weeks. Let's talk about them real quick. Sean Tucker, Bucky Irving, and Rachaad White. All of these guys are going to have to take the place of those injured wide receivers. So if any of those guys I mentioned are on your waiver wire, go out and get them. Who else do we like? How about this wide receiver over there in Baltimore? Rashad Bateman. Last week, he had 4 catches for 121 yards on 4 targets and a touchdown. We've been talking about him for weeks. Hit that subscribe button. We've been talking about this guy. You'd have had 20-some points for this guy if you'd have picked him up like we told you 2 weeks ago. Who else do we like? How about this rookie we talked about in our NFL draft preview shows? Tony Franklin of the Denver Broncos. He's only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Finally, the rookie came on, and he had 5 catches for 50 yards on 6 targets. This is a guy I would consider going and picking up. He is a rookie, so don't expect him to produce every week. Another guy we were like, how about Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns? With the trades over there with Amari Cooper, Cedric Tillman is only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 8 catches for 81 yards on 12 targets. And his running mate over there, Elijah Moore, he had 6 catches for 41 yards on 7 targets. And a guy you can't forget about, we've been talking about for weeks, probably not on your waiver wire, is Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. He's owning 45% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 4 catches for 125 yards. He's competing now with Amari Cooper and Khalil Shakir, so he might not always produce, but I tell you what, you guard this guy one-on-one, he's going to burn you. We also talked about him in our NFL draft preview shows, which you can look at on YouTube, on Facebook, or Twitter. I tell you what, who else do we like at wide receiver? How about this guy? Joshua Palmer of the Los Angeles Chargers. He's only owned in less than 10% of fantasy football leagues. He was supposed to be the number 1 receiver out there, but he's not. I'm not sure what's going on. They got a ton of injuries. Last week, he had 4 catches for 63 yards on 5 targets. Who else do we like? Better keep an eye on Jalen Tolbert for the Dallas Cowboys. He's still only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. He was on bye last week. And a guy we haven't talked about for years, he used to play for the Dolphins. How about Cedric Wilson? He plays for the New Orleans Saints. He's not owned in any leagues. He had 6 catches for 57 yards and a touchdown. A guy I would keep my eye on at running back is Tyler Goodson for the Indianapolis Colts. He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. He's the handcuff to Jonathan Taylor. So if Jonathan Taylor comes back, I wouldn't be spending a lot of money on Tyler Goodson. But last week, Tyler Goodson, with Jonathan Taylor out, had 14 carries for 51 yards and a touchdown. He didn't have any receptions, but I tell you what, this kid can catch the ball. And if you have Jonathan Taylor, I'd go out and pick him up because you're going to need him. Who else do we like at running back? We like Jalen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's owned in 51% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 12 carries for 44 yards and caught 2 balls for 15 yards. We told you about the Tampa Bay situation. We love Bucky Irvin. We love Rashad White. And we love Sean Tucker, who's only owned in 16% of fantasy football leagues. With the injuries to Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, look, they can't just keep throwing the ball every play to Cade Otton. They're going to be using these running backs in unique ways. I'd go out and make sure those guys aren't available. And I'll tell you what else we like at running back. How about this guy, Ray Davis for the Buffalo Bills? He's still only owned in 25% of fantasy football leagues. He's the handcuff to James Cook, who's susceptible to injuries. Last week, Ray Davis had 5 carries for 41 yards and a touchdown with 1 reception. Guys I would keep on my radar. We talked about some of these rookies in our NFL draft preview show. If you haven't watched, go out there and watch it. We'll put a link in the description. So how about Kamani Vidal for the Los Angeles Chargers? Didn't do much last week, but he's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues, and he's the handcuff to J.K. Dobbins. We also like Trey Benson of Arizona, who's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. And if you've got the room on your bench, man, go out and pick up me some Kendra Miller down there at New Orleans. Alvin Kamara signed a new contract this week, but Kendra Miller is still a young player. Last week, he had 6 carries for 36 yards with 2 receptions. These are guys that I would be picking up, putting on my roster in case you have an injury for your playoff run. Who do we like at tight end? We already told you about Cade Otton. Go out and get him, man. This guy's going to be a superstar this year because who else do they got to throw the ball to? I'll tell you what, who else I like. How about Hunter Henry? Hunter Henry last week had 8 catches for 92 yards on 9 targets from rookie Drake May. I'll tell you what, we're going to talk about Drake May because that's the guy we're going to go pick up. But if you need a couple sleepers at tight end, how about Jatavion Sanders of the Carolina Panthers, another guy we talked about in our NFL draft preview show. When you get a chance, check it out. He's only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, Andy Dalton couldn't find anybody to throw the ball to, so Jatavion Sanders had 6 catches for 61 yards on 6 targets. They play the Denver Broncos in Denver, so he'll have another decent chance for a big game. And then you got this guy that we've been talking about for the Seattle Seahawks for years. Now he's with the Los Angeles Chargers, Will Dissly. Last week he had 8 catches for 81 yards on 11 targets. This week they play the New Orleans Saints. With the injuries out there, that like players like Hayden Hurst, who's usually the starter, and Quentin Johnson is their number 1 receiver, and of course Mr. Palmer we talked about earlier at wide receiver. Hey, these guys aren't stepping up. The running game's not doing as well as it did earlier in the year. Hey, they're throwing the ball to this guy, Will Dissly. So keep an eye on him. I'd have him on my radar. Hey, we got some quarterbacks we like. We just talked about Drake May. Why not go out and pick him up if you need a quarterback? Last week, Drake May was 26 of 37. He had 276 yards with 2 touchdowns and a quarterback rating of 109 when they went overseas and played in England. Another guy that's going to be a hot pickup this week is Russell Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was an average quarterback last week, but he had 16 of 29 for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns with a quarterback rating of 109. He also rushed the ball 3 times for 3 yards. We're suggesting you go out and get yourself some Russell Wilson. Keep an eye on your radar for Jameis Winston for the Cleveland Browns. He's only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. With the season-ending injury to Deshaun Watson, they play the Baltimore Ravens, who's defense is banged up. The other quarterback for Cleveland is Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I look for Jameson Winston to get the start this week, so keep an eye on him. Other guys I'd have on my radar, why not Bo Nix? For Denver, he plays Carolina. How about Matthew Stafford, who's getting back Cooper Kupp this week? And maybe somebody cut Tua Tagovailoa for the Miami Dolphins. If he's out there, I'd go get him. And you can't forget about our old friend Marcus Mariota for the Washington Commanders versus the Chicago Bears. The rookie quarterback Daniels got hurt, so this guy's going to get a chance to play. He's a decent quarterback. I wouldn't put too much on it against that Chicago defense for Mr. Mariota. Who else do we like? Well, how about these defenses? I tell you what, if you need a good defense, I'm taking Houston versus Indianapolis. I also like the Chargers versus New Orleans this week, going up against the rookie quarterback. Denver's playing Carolina. Denver's secondary's banged up, but they're a good matchup against Carolina, who's struggling. Might have to go back to their quarterback if Andy Dalton's not available. Apparently, he was in a car accident. And I'll tell you right now, the Baltimore Ravens at the Cleveland Browns should be a no-brainer. Unfortunately, the Ravens aren't on many people's radar or waiver wire. I'll tell you what, if you need a good kicker, because the weather's changing, you got to go out there and get yourself an indoor kicker because the weather doesn't change when you're playing indoors, and we like these guys. How about the kicker for the Minnesota Vikings, Will Reichard? He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. And another guy that's owned in 40% of fantasy football leagues is Jake Bates of the Detroit Lions. Well, that's it for week 8 of the NFL Weekly Waiver Wire Report. Make sure you hit that damn subscribe button. I'm Buster Brown. The show is called Redemption Rehab. Good luck.